Wow. My colleague was just asking how many people does the auditorium seat, and we learned 250, and we're really pleased to see so many people here this evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight. My name is Jane Milosch. I'm actually not from the Getty, but I direct the Smithsonian Provenance Research Initiative in Washington, D.C. This evening's program is actually here at the Getty because it's part of a week-long gathering of German-American museum professionals who work on World War II-era provenance research. And many of the attendees, in fact, I hope all of the attendees are in the audience. It is also part of what's a 3-year program known as PrEP, which began last year at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and at the Berlin National Museums, and will conclude in 2019 at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. PrEP, the German-American Provenance Research Exchange for Museum Professionals, is a systematic, international, scholarly exchange launched in partnership, this is not easy, with 7 German-American institutions, each which hold very important documentation in regards to World War II-era provenance research. The co-organizers of this partnership is the Staatliche Preußische Kulturbesitz and the Berliner Nationalmuseum, the National Museums in Berlin, and the Smithsonian, working together with the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Getty Research Institute, the Zentralinstitut für Kunstgeschichte in München, and the Dresden State Art Collections, also with the collaboration of the German Center for Lost Art, also known as the Deutsches Zentrum Kulturgutverluste in Magdeburg. This past week, 26 PrEP participants, curators, provenance researchers, collections managers, archivists, IT specialists, all of them have been meeting in discussions, seminars, and tours with experts at the GRI and other LA institutions. We study the academic, museological, legal, and social terrains of both Germany and the US in regards to World War II-era provenance research. We are working to better share our research, our resources, and our results with greater transparency, and with the aid that all of new technology can give us. So meeting at the GRI has been a fabulous experience because they are leaders in provenance and in technology. And we are grateful to the many Getty colleagues who I've seen in the audience this evening for sharing their expertise with us all week. And let me tell you, you're now connected and part of the PrEP network. PrEP is focusing on advancing World War II-era provenance research of Asian, decorative, and graphic arts. But what we are learning can be extended to address provenance research more broadly. For example, antiquities and post-colonial collections. In your program booklet, there's a little bit more information about PrEP. I'm particularly pleased that the GRI would be hosting our 3rd exchange. When I first learned about how much provenance research was being done in Germany, of which few American scholars were aware of, I wanted to figure out a way how to facilitate an effective international exchange between Germany and the US. I met with GRI Director Thomas Gaehtgens, who is a very respected art historian, professor, and director both in the US and in Europe. He encouraged me to pursue this idea, so thank you, Thomas, for your encouragement to build this what we call a research Autobahn. I would like to thank him, as well as my colleague Claudia Einicke, who is also at the GRI, and she too shares the background in that she is a German art curator who's worked many years in the US and most recently at LACMA. She and Thomas have created a marvelous PrEP program for us this week, including the program for this evening, which Thomas will introduce us to in a moment. In closing, I would like to thank not only this evening's panelists for what they're going to share with us today in the conversation, but also the PrEP participants from German and American museums of all sizes and ranges, also my fellow steering committee members, especially Lori Stein, senior advisor to SPRI, Christelle Force from the Met, sorry. She is a force to be reckoned with, so the name is appropriate. Christian Fuhrmeister from the Zentralinstitut für Kunstgeschichte, where our 4th PrEP exchange will take place this fall, and also to my colleagues in Berlin who are not watching this now, but will eventually, Carola Teleke and Petra Winter, for supporting this event, and thank them for the important work they are doing. Because again, it can't be done in isolation, it must be done in collaboration. Finally, I would like to thank our PrEP sponsors, Germany's federally funded Program for Transatlantic Encounters, financed by the European Recovery Program, the German government's Commissioner for Culture and Media, the 7 PrEP partner institutions, as well as the Smithsonian Women's Committee, and we're grateful to the individual donors such as James Hayes, Suzanne and Norman Cohn, and the Ferdinand Milosch Stiftung Berlin. So now I turn the program over to Thomas for what I'm sure will be a very exciting time.
Good evening. My name is Thomas Gaehtgens, and as the director of the GRI, it is also my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's presentation and discussion about the role of provenance research, especially concerning the Nazi period. In the context of the workshop Jane was speaking about, we wanted to address a larger public and address the importance of provenance research and transfer the idea that provenance research has to be supported as a major field in art history. We therefore invited Simon Goodman, who has experienced over several decades how difficult it was to research an extremely valuable family patrimony stolen and dispersed during the Nazi period. He and his brother Nick, why don't you stand up so that people could address to him? It's not only him, but also Nick. He and his brother Nick have been successful in tracing a good part of the works, but only in some cases were they able to get them back or find settlements. Simon will give a short presentation of their accomplishments, and then we will have a conversation with Stephanie Barron, Senior Curator of LACMA, Head of the Department of Modern Art, and author of groundbreaking exhibitions like Degenerate Art, The Fate of the Avant-Garde in Nazi Germany, Unforgettable, and many others more, and James Welu, Director Emeritus of the Worcester Art Museum, who served as President of the Association of Art Museums Directors and was the chair of the Accreditation Commission of the American Alliance of Museums. He was very active when these institutions launched their initiatives regarding Nazi confiscated art and was also involved in one case concerning the Goodman collection, as we will see later. The Getty Research Institute looks back to a long history of collecting archives of galleries, art dealers, art and art collectors, which makes it a fertile field of provenance research. Since 2008, we have enlarged our research interests and invested in Nazi-area provenance research. Over the last years, the Research Institute led an ambitious collaborative effort to locate, digitize, and add to the provenance index all extant German language auction catalogs dating from the Nazi area. And right now we are even working on the earlier period. At the same time, while we were engaged in research about the Nazi period, a very active and silent researcher was working in our library to explore what could be found about the extremely valuable and important collection of the German family Goodman, originally from Dresden, which founded and developed the Dresdner Bank into one of the most important German banks later located in Berlin, with branches and collaborations all over Europe. I personally had no idea about the presence of this reader in our reading room. One day, a friend sent me the book, The Orpheus Clock, by the author Simon Goodman. I did not get the point right away that Goodman was Goodman. I could have thought about that. However, this became clear very quickly when I started reading this fascinating book, a real page-turner. The book is an extremely moving historical document, brilliantly documented and written, which engages the reader to follow the history of this important and successful Jewish family from the 19th century through World War I, the 1920s, and the tragedy of the Nazi period and the Holocaust. The second part, however, is just as astonishing, and we will hear about this more tonight, because it introduces the reader into the difficulties, the chase, the disappointments, the frustrations experienced by the surviving family members fighting for the reconstitution of their valuable former collection, which has been scattered all over the world. However, these chapters are about much more. They are about justice and the long, exhausting, agonizing fight to get justice, or, as Simon puts it, unfinished business. Simon's father had tried to recover these looted works, which had ended up in the collections of Hitler and Goering, or sold to dealers and collectors, with many ending in museums all over the world. While Simon's father's attempts to recuperate the family treasures had been largely unsuccessful and in fact met with much hostility, it would galvanize his son's dedication to pursuing their restitution over decades. It has also at times required legal action, and the Goodman brothers have been instrumental in changing policies for Nazi looted art restitution. Simon brought the first settled suit in a US court to recover art stolen during the war, a Degas landscape at the Art Institute Chicago, and succeeded with the first major restitution in the Netherlands in the post-war era. The Goodmans helped mobilize a conference involving 44 countries to adopt the so-called Washington Principles for resolving issues of Nazi confiscated art, and Simon has given testimony before the US Senate Judiciary Committee in favor of extending the statute of limitations concerning Holocaust-era looted art. I could personally not stop reading this book up to the last chapters, where the author mentions the library of the Getty Research Institute several times, where he visibly has been an extended reader. And at the very end, in the acknowledgements, he thanks all those at the Getty Research Institute. The next day, I went into the library and asked some of the librarians, "Did you read the Orpheus Clock?" The answer was, "No." "Do you know an author named Simon Goodman?" "Well, yes, I think we have this name in our list of readers, but he has not been seen for a while. But I got his mail address." I wrote him. We met for lunch and some other occasions, and here he is again. Please join me in welcoming Simon Goodman.
Thank you, Thomas, Dr. Professor Gaehtgens. And thanks to all at the GRI and PrEP for inviting me. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. The Getty is actually one of my favorite places. I'm a bit like a kid in a candy store here in the archives, in the photo files down in the basement. Every time I come here, I find a new tiny little clue. Sometimes it's a big clue as to uncovering some of the many still missing pieces from my family, from the Goodman collection. So I've assembled these a dozen or so pictures. I haven't got a prepared speech, but they're all very much related to our quest for understanding and discovering the provenance of many artworks, and specifically those from my family's collection. So this is a lovely landscape by Jan van Goyen, or van Goyen, as they say in Holland, which I've tried pronouncing Dutch for, my father would, shout at me the correct pronunciation, and I sort of remember. But anyway, this is an interesting case because it epitomizes a happy solution and cooperation between my family, an important US museum, the Worcester Art Museum in Massachusetts, and actually this was one of the first times that Sotheby's had called my family, they called my brother, in fact, Nick, to say, well, there's a Van Goyen painting that I think you ought to look at. And so Nick went to Massachusetts. I think you were working in Boston at the time anyway, so it was a kind of kismet. It all fitted together. And we weren't quite sure what had happened to this painting, what had happened to it after the war, and we had to piece together the provenance. Today we know what it is. This painting was taken from my grandfather by Karl Haberstock in 1941. Haberstock sold it to no less than Adolf Hitler, and it was destined for the Linz Museum. And at the end of the war, with the Allies bombing Germany, it was stored in Alt-Aussee, in the salt mines in north-central Austria, where the monuments men, fortunately, got there just in time before the Russians did. And again, an interesting tie-in, several of the great monuments men officers had been or would be later curators at the Worcester Art Museum. So we have this another connection there. These were wonderful art enthusiasts and patriots who recovered so much so quickly, and it's a great shame that the monuments men were disbanded in, I think, the end of 1946. They didn't really have time to finish their job. So paintings like this were not repatriated, or they actually were repatriated. They weren't returned to the rightful owners or their heirs, the survivors, that is, in this case. I should preface here, my grandparents were killed in camps, my grandfather in Theresienstadt and my grandmother in Auschwitz. So my father had survived the war. He joined the British Army, but he was nearly killed by a German bomb, but he recovered, and he was one of the first civilians to arrive in Holland, and which is where most of the collection had been taken from. We were, as Thomas points out, from Germany, originally from Dresden. My grandfather had, poor man, in the First World War, he'd spent 3-4 years in a British camp. So he had a knack of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He got out of the camp, fortunately, and was only allowed out providing he domiciled, at least temporarily, in a neutral country. They didn't want him going back to Germany right away. So he settled in Holland, a nice, peaceful, neutral country, so we thought. The monuments men, therefore, rightly figured out that this painting came from the Netherlands, from the Goodman collection, and they returned a lot of our things to the new Dutch government, who then, well, they didn't call us, they waited for us to call them. It turned out my father, cut a long story short, had to buy this back from the Dutch government based on the theoretical amount of money that Karl Haberstock had deposited into a frozen bank account, because he, these art dealers made a point of showing that they had paid for what they got. I mean, it was a shell game. The money went back to Germany at the end of the year. But Haberstock could point out to Hitler's office, look, I've paid good money, and he'd make a healthy profit from the Führer. And so eventually my father gets this back, and he has to sell it to an art dealer in Amsterdam called Piet de Boer, who'd been a collaborator during the war, but before the war had actually been quite a sort of trusted art advisor. It's very strange, these stories. I mean, I'll come up with some other names where people are to be trusted up till the middle of the 30s, and then they switch to the other side, and then miraculously they come back to reason after 1945. So Pete de Boer, bought it for a song for my father so that my father could pay his legal bills. And that's kind of the sad story. And at least today it ends up in a wonderful museum and is well cared for. And so I'm going to jump here. This is where my story starts, in a sense. After my father died, he hadn't really told me or my brother much of anything of what he'd been doing all his life. I didn't even know what job he had for the first 15 years of my... Anyway, it turned out he became a travel agent to facilitate him moving around Europe. But what he was really doing was looking for what was still missing. And he dies, he leaves me and Nick all his old papers and old art catalogues, programs, and some photos. There's a negative of this, and Nick and I go hunting for the Impressionists to begin with. We thought it might be sort of easier there, and there were actually 2 Degas that I was looking for. I would have searched here at the GRI. This would have been the first place I would have come to, except it didn't exist yet. So I've been doing this now for 23 years or something, which is kind of crazy. I found the first color picture I'd ever seen of this in the Art Museum at UCLA. They were also very helpful. And I was kind of shocked to discover here is one of the sort of many, this is not exactly a catalogue raisonné, but a monograph of Degas' monotypes. The landscape is technically a monotype. And I was shocked to discover, let's see if this works, up here, Provenance, 4e vente Degas. Well, the fourth sale of Degas is actually in 1919. And then the next thing here is Hans Wendland, Paris. Well, Hans Wendland was actually a very well-known Nazi dealer. He was categorized by the ALIU, which is the Art Looting Intelligence Division of the Monuments Men outfit. Hans Wendland is categorized as the most prolific and important dealer in looted art in France, Switzerland, and even Germany. So this got me angry and set me on my course, where I still am here today. We eked out a settlement. We tracked the Degas to a very important collection in Chicago, belonged to a billionaire who surrounded himself with sort of $600 an hour lawyers, and this is 95, so today they would probably be charging a couple of thousand a month, an hour, excuse me. Anyway, a settlement was reached. I can't go into all of this with too much detail, but I mean, I hope maybe some of you will read my book, The Orpheus Clock. It was our first settlement. Here's the next Degas, which we have a room full, or at least half a room full of dedicated researchers. This is still missing. The last mention of it is being confiscated by the ERR in Paris in 1942, and it's marked down as modern to be exchanged. So we can assume it was sent to Switzerland and traded either for hard currency or old masters, whatever the Germans wanted. So this is, and one of the problems is interesting, doing my research is sometimes you can't be sure who the artist is. Other times, it's not clear what the title is. I'm giving an example here. Femme se chauffant, scène de toilette, femme nue, se faisant coiffer. Those are just 3 of about 7 titles I've seen potentially, which gives you an idea of how complex it is to even start to look for these things. Where do you look? Anyway. All right. This, fortunately, our dad had left us just a few photos. It's very sad. We now realize that all our family letters, our family library, and all our documents and records were destroyed by the Nazis during the war. So these snippets of information, of memories, have survived, and this was one of the very few photos we had in my father's boxes of his house, where he, was raised by his parents in a lovely part of Holland called Heemstede. It's near Haarlem, just west of Amsterdam. What's interesting about this painting is this is a François Boucher. This is a little Jean Barbeau, which we thought was by Goya, but it's not. She's not even a Spanish woman, as it turns out. She's a Venetian woman. But so that's the idea. See, we were looking for Goya, Spanish woman with a veil, and it turns out to be Jean Barbeau, Venetian woman with a veil. And here, again, another sort of happy coincidence is a Jean-Étienne Lyotard tea set service, lovely still life. And some of you might have seen it because it's here today in this wonderful museum. This was another painting that my father was able to get back with the help of Rose Valland. This had been taken from our storage in Paris and eventually sold to Hitler again, or at least went to his museum. Some of our paintings went actually to his office in Berlin, but this was destined for the Linz Museum. And this is a very interesting story here. I discovered that there was reputedly a second Lyotard that had been sold to Hitler. So it doesn't really look that much like a Lyotard, and probably this glass here, I'm sorry, I don't have a better version of this photo. The French government sold this painting after the war. So it was returned, it was recovered by the Monuments Men, it was deduced that it had been taken from Paris, and it was sent back to Paris, and then the French government sold it without contact, even though my father was regularly banging on the doors of Rose Valland, Albert Henrault, and all the others at the recuperations division of the French Ministry of Culture. Anyways, so what's interesting about this painting is that a consortium of art dealers, Dutch, French, and German, concocted, they even cut this painting down to size so it matched the real Lyotard in dimensions, and they turned around and sold this pair, these two pendants, to Heinrich Voss, who was in charge of the Linz Museum, and for a lot of money. So what's extraordinary is that you have, in the middle of the war, these dealers, the French one was called Marteau, the Dutch one was called Jan Postma, and most importantly in Berlin, Helmut Lange, who had taken over the Paul Grauper auction house. They conspired to defraud Adolf Hitler, of all people. They had so many looted paintings lying around. It's amazing that they went to such trouble. But it gives you an idea of all the strange characters involved in this wonderful quest that I am on, and apparently half of you are on too. So, moving on. Oh yes, here's another lovely painting that went to our friend Herr Hitler as well. And again, it's not even clear how Adrian Isenbrandt spells his name, and today actually some art historians claim that Isenbrandt might not even exist. Before the war, he was an extremely, well-respected Netherlandish painter, and now it's not quite clear, is there such a person? So, this is one of his pseudonyms, which I rather like, the Master of the Seven Sorrows of the Virgin, as it just rolls off the tongue. So anyway, but it gives you an idea of the breadth of my grandfather's collection. He had many. There was a Memling that was very similar style that then some people reclassified as by Gérard David, and so it went on. This painting, this went to Linz as well. And after the war, oddly enough, my father had to sell this to De Boer as well, so he had to make friends with the people who would probably collaborated against this. This was one of these things that the main perpetrators of the Nazi era were arrested by the Allies, but the vast majority were given a slap on the wrist. Some went through a sort of a 1 year or so denazification program, and by the end of the 40s, beginning of the 50s, everybody was back at work. Here's me with my lovely wife, May. This gives a bit of an idea. Well, in the background is another German portrait that went to Hitler. This is by Jacob Elsner. This is us in Holland in 2002, when my brother and I finally get back several hundred pieces from our family's collection that the Dutch government had sat on since the end of the war. Either some pieces were those that my father could not raise enough money to buy, so they kind of reverted by default to the Dutch National Collection, and other pieces, such as these two wonderful wedding cups by Hans Petzold, they didn't even tell us about. And in 1960, they were absorbed into the Rijksmuseum collection, and it took us until 2002 to get them back. To give you an idea, these, my great-grandfather, Eugen Goodman, who was the founder of the Dresdner Bank, he bought these from Mathilde von Rothschild in Frankfurt. I mean, they had belonged to her late husband, Karl von Rothschild, and it gives a sort of indication of the circles these collectors moved in. The Rothschilds had actually, along with the Oppenheimers, had put up a lot of money when we launched the Dresdner Bank as a public bank. So these were families that had cooperated and in business and in art collecting too. So we're celebrating our great success. I mean, it was after this big restitution, there was an even bigger restitution to our friends, the heirs of the Jacques Houdsticker, which, by the way, Houdsticker had, talking of Provenance again, had sold the genuine Lyotard to my grandfather. His gallery was actually next door to my grandfather's private bank on the Herenracht in Amsterdam. All right, this is work I did here at the wonderful GRI. It's a strange painting that my grandfather bought by Franz von Stuck, and my grandmother hated this painting, it turned out. Judging by the date my grandfather bought it in Munich, I think the Wall Street stock market had just crashed. And being a banker, I think he needed to kind of divert himself. I mean, so he wanted something to take his mind off. This ends up on back to Karl Haberstock, the first forced sale between my grandfather and Karl Haberstock. Most of the other paintings on that list are old masters, and then this seems to be thrown in as an afterthought. And at first it just said ein Stück, and I thought it could mean a piece of something. It wasn't even clear it was a painting. And then I found another letter in German archives, Haberstock trying to sell this, and here then he says it's a sketch called Die Sünde, or the Sin. And to my horror, Franz von Stuck had painted actually about 20 paintings called The Sin, and another dozen at least called Sensuality, which basically consist of the same woman and lascivious snake. So you have an idea of even once you've figured out what the artist is called and what the painting is called, then measurements are another vital thing in research. As you can see here, there's something strange has happened at the bottom of the painting. Originally, the frame ended there. Stuck's frames were very specific and often decorated and part of the actual, the final work of art. Somebody had thrown the frame away, sadly, probably during the war, and rolled this painting up to, I imagine, smuggle it through probably American military lines, because the painting ends up on the art market in Munich in the 60s. And they've extended the new frame, comes down to here. So the dimensions are not even the same. I mean, it took me 4 years to find the dimensions of our painting, and then to my horror, this one, it's longer. Didn't match, but finally, Karl Haberstock's inventories were published by the University of Augsburg, and there was a tiny little black and white at the back of this huge catalogue, and it had a number under the painting, and that number corresponded to an inventory he'd done of things he'd taken from my grandfather's house. So finally I could call my dear aunt in Florence and say, I found it, is it that one? And she went, oh, yes, I suppose so. And she wasn't crazy about it, but there we are. And another wonderful piece I found again here at the Getty. This is by Hans Baldung Green. This was destined again for Hitler. I mean, so I'm going back. The gold cups, the Petzold cups, had actually gone to Hermann Göring. So he did get some things, but being number 2, he had to wait in line. This painting is stolen from Hitler's agent in Paris. It's very strange. There's 8 of our paintings that are loaded onto a train from Paris to Berlin in 1941. And when they get to the other end, there are only 7. And Hitler's lawyer, I found these letters, is furious. Karl Haberstock is groveling, I'll refund you. And it's that Jewish devil, Fritz Gutzmann, who's conned us somehow. The poor man, my grandfather's under house arrest. How he pulled off this sleight of hand in Paris, I don't know. But so the painting literally disappears until I went through every book on Hans Baldung Green. It was never found by the monuments men. It was never found in the end of the war. I don't know, 8 years ago, I was here at the GRI, and I found one book by a certain Gert van der Osten, that this, his was the only book that mentioned this painting. He'd actually been on sabbatical at Princeton in New Jersey in the 50s, and he'd gone to check out what the opposition had at Rutgers University, and so he scribbled in the notes of this book, yes, I saw this in New Brunswick. So I headed to Rutgers, and again I came across a wonderful American museum, the Zimmerli, run by delightful, decent people. It took me a year or so to convince them. I presented a telephone directory's worth of evidence, and they had to plow through it, and eventually they returned it. So Hitler never got it, and there he is. One of the many. My grandfather had this room that was lined with German Renaissance male portraits. My poor aunt used to think they were all rather ugly too, which is kind of one of the reasons he finally decided to buy a few Impressionist paintings. But anyway, I'm jumping around. This is another example of how hard it is tracking anything. We always thought this was by Willem van der Velde, and it took me until, I think 2 years ago, I tracked this down in Switzerland, in Zurich. Not a great place to find a looted piece of work usually. Well, Swiss law is such that they're on very solid ground, and they don't normally have to deal with you at all. However, I've noticed in recent years that there's been a thaw, much as there has been in the art world in general, just as Nick got the tip about the Van Goyen at the Worcester Art Museum by our friend Lucien Simmons at 4 or 5 years before that, Sotheby's were trying to take me and my brother to court and suing us for more than we had. And Christie's were only barely more civil at the time. This is in the middle 90s when we first discovered the Degas. Then we discovered a Renoir that Sotheby's had sold, and then to add insult to injury, we found a Botticelli in a Sotheby's catalogue as well. So they didn't really like us at the time. You know, we were upsetting the apple cart. It was as if, you know, I mean, one of the complaints was that we were disrupting their ability to conduct business as normal. Yes. But at least with the Botticelli, they did have my grandfather's name in the Provenance. So it was almost brazen. I don't know which I like more, you know, when we're lost completely, or whether they openly say, yes, this came from the Goodman family, and yet, well, why don't we have it anymore? The Swiss auction house actually, you know, compensated my family fairly reasonably. What was interesting was it was being sold as attributed to Jan van der Capelle instead. So this is probably why it had taken me, you know, I'd been through every Van der Velde catalogue raisonné. It wasn't there. I thought, but it looks like a Van der Velde. I mean, I've seen so many, you know, and yet it's not. They're contemporaries and they painted the same kind of thing. But there we are. And I'm back to a painting that I'm still looking for. And again, this is an interesting thing. Today, this battle scene, which was a Cassoni panel, although some experts say it's a spaliera, which is the higher panel on a Cassoni set, if you like. Before the war, my family thought this was by Uccello, and so did even Bernard Berenson at the time. Today, apparently, I mean, then it was reclassified as by a Florentine painter called Utili, and today, now, he's called Biagio d'Antonio, which is so it's the opposite of Isenbrandt. But before the war, Biagio d'Antonio didn't exist. Nobody knew he existed. Today, well, they knew the paintings, but they couldn't connect or didn't have a name and that connected them. I mean, today there's a lovely Biagio d'Antonio in the National Gallery in Washington. There's one very similar to this in the Royal Museum in Stockholm. And so, thanks to archives, I traced this through Harvard University. They also have a very good photo file, and they took over Bernard Berenson's the Villa Tati's photo file and digitized them, which is wonderful. The last record of this painting it's interesting. My grandfather, it's sort of sentimental value. This is about the first painting after he'd been freed after the First World War. He went back to Paris. He had this little Italian art gallery off the Place Vendôme run by a certain Count Trotti, and he went and bought his first painting to sort of celebrate his freedom. What's odd is, after the war, this painting is being peddled in Italy and New York by a man called Trozzi. So you got to be very careful. So one is TTI and the other one is ZZI. You know, if you write this quickly, they're not the same people. It's just one of those weird coincidences. Trozzi was offering it to Wildenstein, and I contacted the Wildensteins. And I did get a reply, at least, but it was a negative reply. They said, no, we never bought it. So there you have it. The trail runs cold in 1955. Again, you know, somebody can Facebook text me, it would be wonderful. All right, here's back to my great-grandfather, the Renaissance silver and gold collection. I tracked this wonderful piece and this wonderful piece to the Castle Museum in Stuttgart, What was strange, they both originated from my family's collection. They had both been taken from my grandfather's house in Heemstede in March 1942, and they both ended up in the same museum. You'd think, and they'd been donated by the same person to a German shoe magnet called Femmersdorf. But when I researched this very thoroughly, it turned out that the Ostrich Automaton, which was my aunt's favorite piece, because normally the family, the kids weren't allowed. This was all locked up in a safe room most of the year, and on special occasions they'd bring out the automaton so the children could, marvel at the Kunstkammer, the collection of the family. The little bear beats his drum, I think, every quarter of an hour. It still works, and the ostrich will flap his wings on the hour. I mean, it's a wonderful piece. But yet, I finally, rather like the Van Goyen, discovered that my father did get this back. It was a brutal, it took until like 1959, but he did get it back, and he sold it in New York and had to share the proceeds, along with several other pieces, with his cousins, who were equal heirs of the Eugen Goodman collection. But this piece, the Orpheus Clock, and there was one other clock, the Reinhold Clock, had not been treated the same way. We did not get those back. These two clocks and several smaller actual timepieces, Julius Böhler, a well-known art dealer in Munich, along with two partners of his, Mr. Sauermann and actually Hoffmann, who was also Hitler's personal photographer, had a share in this. They were supposed to turn these over to the US 7th Army, the GIs, who got the inventory of the Renaissance silver that they'd taken, and they had to have it all boxed up by the next day. They collected hundreds of pieces, but this clock, the Reinhold clock, and several other pieces, Böhler's partner Sauermann actually buried in the sand on the shores of Lake Starnberg, south of Munich. And the American soldiers left without these clocks. Eventually, they were cleaned off, dusted off, not very successfully. When my wife May and I went to inspect these for the first time in Stuttgart, it still had sand in it. They had been smuggled from Bavaria to Switzerland, where Julius Böhler's son had a 50% share in an art gallery in Lucerne, and in middle 60s, these clocks had been sold to Fremmersdorf, the shoe magnet and clock aficionado. So this gives an example of the complexities. There were two pieces from the same collection. They'd been looted by the same person. They'd been stored by the same person. They'd been bought donated to the museum by this, and yet, this one wasn't. So this wasn't legitimate, and the state of Baden-Württemberg had several meetings and decided to give this and the Reinhold clock back. So this is actually, amazingly, the first direct restitution my family have had from any branch of the German government. My father did get, which is rather gruesome, compensation for my grandmother's fur coats. They had arrived at Theresienstadt. They thought they were headed for Italy, but they'd been deceived, and the train dropped them at the concentration camp instead. And my grandmother, it was a chilly spring. She thought they were getting to Italy and freedom. She was wearing a full-length fur coat and had more. They had 13 trunks accompanying them. They arrived in a Mercedes car. They were driven from the station. So this was one of the few things that the West German government after the war admitted culpability for, and they compensated my father for, I think, 6 fur coats. Go figure. I mean, everything else there, there were paintings that were last seen in Goering's collection. The West German government denied any culpability for, and they said that's a private matter. You have to go to Goering's house. So there we have it. I've probably rambled on too long. It's a long story. That's a synopsis.
Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. This is a fascinating story, and I see you can go on and on. I mean, it's decades that you are on the chase. Simon, what I would like to ask, I mean, first of all, you are very ironic against art historians. I pardon you. But you know, it's always very, very difficult, Isenbrand and the attributions. And anyway, you are and Nick, you are doing this since many decades now. And reading your book, one understands that the first years or the first decades were very difficult because there was no documentation from your family side, but also no documentation from the art historian side. So it was really, and there were no computers. So all this is now much, in a certain way, easier. But that's only one side. My question is, after the Washington Principles, and in the last 20 years or so, because now, you know, we are celebrating 20 years of Washington Principles. Is your feeling also that there is a new understanding for what you are doing? And is there an understanding that provenance research is not only legitimate, but also necessary? And the museums and auction houses and dealers are even in a certain way, perhaps helpful to do that. Is that a feeling you can?
Yes, I think in the 20 years plus that I've been doing this with my brother, things have changed dramatically. When we started, the art world resisted us with everything they could. And so did foreign governments to begin with, I think because it was that generation. We were still not so far away from the end of the war, and the perpetrators and the people who had benefited from it, including certain art dealers, museums, some of the same people were still around. I mean, today, here I am, I'm in my, you know, my brother and I are in our 70s now, so, you know, that's the downside of all this. We're I find that the younger generation, particularly in art research and provenance research, is very enthusiastic about what we do, and there seems to be quite a determination to finally open this up. I mean, the art world also, going back to England, you know, Sotheby's, Christie's, and the 19th century, was a very secretive world. And still that's part of the sort of way many galleries behave. I mean, you know, they maintain the anonymity of their clients, but I mean, it was very pervasive. There was, you know, I remember in one of the catalogs I inherited from my father, most of the items had no provenance whatsoever, and then there was one that made me laugh. It simply said, "The property of a lady." That was it, you know, and that was a lot of information in those days. So it's changed a lot. Christie's and Sotheby's have stopped suing us. They're now helping us. They both have well-funded restitution departments run by dedicated each vice presidents. Christie's is run by Monica Dugaud, who actually, even before she joined Christie's, she helped me and my brother with the Swiss bank claims back in the sort of 96, whatever it was. So there's a whole generation that's grown up based on major research, and it's so much better. Even in Germany today, you know, I mean, I think the first time I went to Germany, to be honest, I felt too many ghosts, and I was actually afraid about what I was doing. I don't really feel that anymore, which, you know, so there's been a sea change, and yes, maybe finally, you know, we have enough distance from the end of the Holocaust to be able to deal with this in a sort of scientific way and expose what really happened and put it to rest, maybe. You know, I will rest when I found the last third of our collection, but we're well on our way. So, you know, I'm positive.
Stephanie?
You know, I have to say, seeing an entire room full of art historians and museum people and lawyers and archivists all joining together across 2 continents dealing with provenance makes me feel really good, because when I started this, it was really different. I feel like it's the difference between a computer that was the size of a room and an iPhone. When I began my research in the 1980s, when the wall was still up, to try to reconstruct the degenerate art show that was put on in Munich in 1937, where the works of art were taken not from private individuals, but they were taken from museums. They were taken from state museums. And it was a show that was put together in just a few days in the 1930s, and it took me about 5 years to put it together. I'll just give you one example. I was in Berlin in 1986, and I had heard rumor that there were the original Degenerate Art exhibition had 650 works of art crammed together in small rooms in Munich. There's a catalog, quote unquote, a little brochure. There was no checklist, there was no proper full cataloging of the exhibition. I heard rumor that there were photographs in the archives of the National Gallery in East Berlin of the exhibition. And I, you know, paid my money. I went across Checkpoint Charlie, and I went to the museum, went to the archive. I did this about 5-6 days in a row, and finally the archivist began to trust me, and lo and behold, she brings out in a little brown folder 70 photographs of the exhibition, room by room. And the original exhibition had little handwritten labels next to it that said what museum the works had been taken from, how much of Reichsmarks had been wasted on these terrible things. So, of course, my mouth dropped, and I said, may I photocopy them? No. May I take photographs? No. Everything that I wanted to do was impossible, and I thought, well, I either can steal them. That wasn't going to go so well. Or what else was I going to do? And I think it's really hard, you know, as we hear about everything being digitized. I mean, what was I going to do? I had a notebook, a magnifying glass, and a pencil. I drew them. There were no cell phones. You know, I mean, I drew them, and I went back across the border, and I went back to my apartment every night, and I tried to transcribe what I had found in those photographs. It took me 2 years to try to put this checklist together. And then the fun started of trying to track down where those works were. You know, and I look out and I see, you know, Laurie Stein, I met when I tracked down a Kandinsky, And I wrote to her I wrote to the collector because she was working for a private collector in Chicago. And I said, well, I'm interested in borrowing this painting because it was, on this particular wall, and I sent a photograph in the Degenerate Art. They had no idea. Jonathan Petropoulos was a summer research assistant, as was Christoph Zuschlag. I mean, we were the kind of core early team. But there is a kind of nice connection because when we put the exhibition together, it was Los Angeles, Chicago, and it was never intended to travel beyond that. It went to Washington, and it turned out that it ended up going to Berlin at the end. And there is a connection because these things do take time. The last week of the exhibition was the first claim that was ever made. There was a painting by Paul Klee that was in the collection of the Lenbach House that there was a claim made by the heirs of Sophie Lisitsky-Coopers. And it took ultimately 26 years for that painting to find its home back in the Lenbach House, but with a new label that acknowledges it. And it's an interesting story because the short answer is it had not been owned by the museum in Hanover where it was seized from. It was still private property. They had to work their way through it. She turned out to have married Lisitsky, ended up in Novosibirsk. She was Russian. You had supposed to return things from foreigners. But it's the connection that it took 26 years, but it kind of started the last week of the Degenerate Art Show. So it's a kind of a nice bridge to where we are today.
Well, when I'm here, and here we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Washington Principles, I'm so reminded about how, and I began at the Worcester Art Museum in 1974, probably before many of you were born. But, and it's a museum that had the most monuments people, I want to say, because we also had a secretary, but one curator, 3 directors who were very involved, including George Clooney, because most of you will know George Stout by George Clooney. And yet, at the museum, we didn't know much about the war. It's just amazing how that got covered over. And also at Worcester, as I was mentioning this afternoon to my colleagues here, that the works were taken out of the Worcester Art Museum for safety's sake and spread at 4 different sites across Massachusetts because there was a real fear that Worcester was going to be bombed. Even people in Worcester don't know about that until I tell them about the Monuments Men's story. It was top secret. We didn't find the documents where they were hidden until only about 20 years ago. So I'm just so amazed by how it wasn't covered over, but I do know that after the war, people wanted to move on with their life, and if people were complaining about a lost Monet, people would say, well, we lost our ancestors, isn't that more serious? And I can understand it, but it all sort of broke loose then, in the 90s, as we all well know. As a curator, my field is Dutch and Flemish art, an area that Hitler and his people loved, and I did my work on Vermeer, and he loved Vermeer as well. I did several shows of Dutch paintings from private collections in New England and 1 Flemish paintings from private collections in New England. So I was doing a lot of Provenance research and working at in the Rijksbureau for Art History Research in The Hague. And there was that cloud that was always hanging over there about the dealers, during the war and after the war, but it was all so vague that even as an art historian, I didn't quite understand it. At the same time, I was buying and acquiring a lot of Dutch and Flemish pictures for the museum, which already had a great collection, and the reason I went there initially. But we would always write to the dealers and asking for the provenance, and they would say, well, maybe after you buy it, we'll give you. And I would always follow up with a letter after, and I never got any response as well. So it was all very difficult, so I can appreciate with what Simon and Nick have gone through. And then, of course, after the Washington Principles were established, I got this call from Nick, and we started talking about this Van Goyen. And I got great advice from our colleagues with the AMD, and that was, don't bring in the lawyers right away. Work with the family. And Nick was so engaging, we got on right away on the phone. And so then I said, Nick, we want to work with you. Now, I have to say, in fairness, Nick, had it been our Gauguin, which at that point was worth about $100 million already, but was bought in 1921, so it was not confiscated. That a Van Goyen we could replace, but we wanted to do the right thing. But I also am very sympathetic to my colleagues who are faced with these million-dollar works of art, facing a board of trustees to whom they report to have to stand up to them and say, we have to do the right thing. I really appreciate what they did. But Nick was wonderful to work with, and just quickly, I said, well, I'm going to Holland shortly. I'll look to see what I can find. And you said you were getting more cooperation with the Dutch government by that point, thanks to the incident in Chicago. And I got there in Holland, and I found a photograph of the Van Goyen with written, or typed actually on the card, "Return to the family." And then that for me was not enough evidence, because I thought, well, someone could have typed that later on. But then I went to the Louvre and found another photograph written right on the back of the photo, "Return to the family." Got back and talked to Nick, and you found also information. And then I said, Nick, why don't you come and would you be willing to give a talk to our major donor society? And you put together such a wonderful presentation. And that was just an eye-opener for the audience in Worcester. It was all so new. And that's, I guess, what the comment that, that's the major comment for me, is that someone who lived through that period, how little was spoken about it until the late 90s.
Well, during our workshop, we talked a lot about the fact that the term provenance has just changed. It's not only the genealogical way directly from nowadays into the studio of the artist, but it's much more. It's all the context. The provenance is not only the history of the painting from one gallery to another gallery or to a private owner, but also the question of why was it in this collection, and how was it received in this collection. And I think we all have to do as art historians and as provenance researchers to make this a more important element of our historical work. Simon, you did your job with this book, because this book is not only a book to discover where this work today might be and how to get it back. This book is also about the background and the environment, and about the historical situation when it was moved from one place to the other, and what might have been the reasons for this, and what kind of strange characters were part of this game, So I think this is very important, that we should propagate more that provenance is really a major part of our historical and art historical work. And if we can make that more known and tell the stories also in a better way, we might perhaps get a little bit more money from the government or from other institutions to follow this path.
Well, for me, tracing these artworks enabled me to trace my family history as well, because what's significant is my father was going to take his secrets to the grave, because he wasn't able to share with me and my brother what had happened to his parents. So we had to figure it out for ourselves. It's been at times painful, but also very rewarding by discovering where and when my grandfather, my great-grandfather, even my great-great-grandfather bought something. I get to see who they associated with, how I now understand that my great-grandfather was great friends with J.P. Morgan in New York, and there's the Rothschild connection, and you start to see the world they moved in, and also, particularly in my family's case, all of this is symptomatic of the fact that really not until the end of the Napoleonic Wars does Jewish emancipation really take root in Europe. And it's at that point that they're new, clever, young Jewish guys who have ideas about chemistry, banking, finance, commerce, everything that was relatively new. So people, like my great-grandfather, basically pioneered retail banking in the German Empire. These were innovative guys who had some very clever ideas. The department stores suddenly cropped up all over Berlin. Anyway, so before the Napoleonic Wars and I suppose the end of the Ancien Régime, most art was in the hands of the old aristocracy. So by tracing how my family acquired these beautiful pieces, I'm actually tracking the beginning of the modern world in a sense. You know, suddenly the other dealers or collectors in Germany I see, I mean, half of them are relatives, but they're families like the Arnholts, the Hulschinskis, von Kaufmann. They're all connected, they're all sort of distant cousins, and they're all trading like mad, they're all following each other. And
they lived all in the same place in Berlin?
Yes, in Berlin, they all lived in the Tiergarten, and it was quite a new world they constructed, and they wanted the trappings of aristocracy, and unfortunately then when you had the Nazi revolution, if you like, the new Nazi overlords wanted the same trappings of aristocracy, and but also they wanted to sort of strip Jewish people of all their culture. So, yeah, I mean, it's a big history lesson.
Yeah, perhaps
I was just going to say that I think one of the challenges today, I think it's wonderful when we can have books, we have films, but if we go to museums and we look at the permanent collection, I think the challenge for museums is how do you particularize some of these stories and some of this history so that perhaps the visitor may say, you know, here's a really interesting story, well, I wonder what the story is of the next one. I think it's a challenge for museums in terms of how to really convey this to a wider audience.
So I just wanted to say, perhaps museums also could think a little bit more about their labels.
I absolutely agree, but I think it's also about explaining it, because even if you list the provenance, it needs more to flesh it out to kind of tell the story. I think that is something that we actually have to do a much better job with.
I still think there are so many provenance researchers in this room. We should open a little bit and allow, we are running very late, but and there is a reception and a drink waiting outside. This will go away slowly if we don't keep a certain limit of time, but we should open to some questions in the audience. There is one.
Could the museums do like, instead of having these long tombstones next to the art, if you click on the acquisition number at the Getty, you could get a lot of information about the pieces, so they could be digitized, and you could pull up the background information by that.
No, I think that's, certainly we can do a lot with digitization, and you can kind of get to other layers of information, for sure.
Other question? Yeah.
So, Simon, I'm a reference librarian and archivist who's taking part in the prep training. So when you are done with this project or at some time in the future, where's your archive going?
This is a very good question. I'm very grateful that you raised this question. I had already a very short...
I think there's only one answer. However, my books will go to Berkeley because you don't need any more books.
Okay. Yes, please.
Thank you. I have a question about the way that reconstructing this provenance has maybe helped you and your family overcome the destruction that happened to you during the war, and was that a factor in you pursuing this work with such vigor?
Most definitely. I felt a huge wrong had been obviously committed against my grandparents, but also against my father and his generation after the war. He'd fought in the British Army. He thought they'd won the war. and that everything would go back to normal as it could be. But in fact, that didn't happen because the world changed, and suddenly Russia became the new enemy and Germany became the new ally, and so we were told to forget about it and move on. And that process destroyed my father as a person, and I grew up with that. So this is very therapeutic. Each time we get one little cup back, one Meissen dish, whatever it is, it's a huge victory. I mean, that it goes way beyond the financial value of something, even beyond the artistic value. So yes, it's restoring my family's honor, and in the process, maybe a few others. You know, I mean, we hope we pave the way for others, and it's very rewarding, this path we've been on, because you know, people said you can't change history. Well, we've gone back and changed a little bit of history, actually. So yeah.
One more question, perhaps, up there.
Simon, I'm a docent here at the Getty Villa. I had a question. So your ancestry and your connection to it through the collection, and you're bringing back the pieces one by one, as you've described quite passionately. Is there a particular piece that you acquired that struck more of an emotional response to your connection to your ancestors, or even just an emotional response in general, that you felt maybe caught you off guard?
They're all important to me. When I found the Baldung Green, it happened to have been exactly 500 years after it had been painted, and I was left in the room with, like, he was an old relative of mine. It was a very powerful moment. When I found the clocks, that was a huge moment. But then there are other things. I have my grandfather's old shaving stand in my bedroom that I found it was in the basement of the Rijksmuseum. My brother and I each have one ancient cushion, excuse me. I think they're dated 1656. So it's a miracle that such a thing survives to this day, and especially since the amount of hands that it's been passed through, and somehow it's a little threadbare, but there it is, and maybe my grandmother sat on it. So, I mean, we've got broken Meissen dishes that have been glued lovingly back together again. So it's all of vital, importance.
And full of emotion.
Yes, oh yes.
Okay, I think we should thank Simon and also my colleagues, Stephanie Barron. And I could recommend a very good read. And there is a reception outside for all of you, and you could address more questions to Simon.